into a solid beam, they got what they call these box beams. And what box beams are is like these metal beams that are welded together, but they have a hollow space in the center. So what had happened is, just from the weight of all the people on the 4th floor and the 2nd floor, it pulled on the connectors, and the weight pulled through the weld. The weld on the box beam split. That's what caused the 4th floor walkway to sink initially. Was that split, and it pulled the connectors through, mm-hmm. and which they caught on the other side. Mm-hmm. But at that point, it was really too much weight, and they just came loose. And so when the 4th one went down, the 2nd went with it, because there was nothing holding the 2nd up.
Right.
Didn't have a choice. So and the original design only supported about 60% of the minimum load required by the Kansas City building codes. So how they got this through, nobody's quite sure. The Haven Steel Company had manufactured the rods, and the company objected that the whole rod below the 4th floor would have to be threaded in order to screw on the nuts to hold the 4th floor walkway in place. These threads would be subject to damage as the 4th floor structure was hoisted into place. Haven Steel proposed that 2 separate offset sets of rods be used. The first set suspending the 4th floor walkway from the ceiling, and the second set suspending the 2nd floor walkway from the 4th floor walkway. Haven Steel didn't pay attention. That design change would be fatal. And it was. Because the 4th floor walkway, in orders, not only had to sustain its own weight, but now it had to sustain the weight of that 2nd floor walkway as well. And it's a design flaw so strong that they said any first-year engineering student could have told you, don't do that. It's not good. Now, the serious flaws of the revised design were compounded by the fact that both designs placed the bolts directly through a welded joint connecting 2 C-channels, the weakest structural point in the box beams. The original design was for the welds to be on the sides of the box beams rather than on the top and bottom. Photograph of the record shows excessive deformations of the cross-section. During the failure, the box beams split along the weld, and the nut supporting them slipped through the resulting gap, which was consistent with reports that the upper walkway fell several inches first, after which the nut was held only by the upper side of the box beams. Then the upper side of the box beams failed as well, allowing the entire walkway to fall in a cascading failure. And the companies that pulled this tried to hide it to some extent. A court order was required to get all these pieces out of storage so they could be looked at. Investigators concluded that the underlying problem was a lack of proper communication between Jack D. Gillum and Associates and Haven Steel. In particular, the drawings prepared by Gillum and Associates were only preliminary sketches, but Haven Steel interpreted them as finalized drawings. Gillum and Associates failed to review the initial design thoroughly, and engineer Daniel M. Duncan accepted Haven Steel's proposed plan via phone call without performing necessary calculations on the 4th floor beams. Reports in court testimony cited a feedback loop of architects' unverified assumptions, each having believed that someone else had performed calculations and checked reinforcements, but without any actual root in documentation or review channels. In other words, all these guys assumed that somebody else had done the heavy lifting on it. Said that they'd sat down, they'd done the calculations, and that it was all going to work. And that's what the gentleman meant when he said it was characterized by everybody walking away with responsibility. Nobody sat down and went, okay, I'm going to take responsibility and I'm going to do the math and I'm going to make sure this all works the way they've redesigned it. Nobody did that. Well, again, let's remember the culture that they're in. They're under enormous pressure to build fast, build swift. So they're trying to get things done as fast as possible. So not having to do the calculations probably means they can get on to the next bit of work and, keep the process rolling the way they were supposed to.
Yeah, well, I'm glad things aren't like that now, because building fast, building swift doesn't always mean it's going to support.
Right. Now, eventually, and like I said, it was Jack D. Gillam of Jack D. Gillam and Associates who would publicly say that the design flaw was so obvious that any first-year engineering student could figure it out if only it had been checked by anybody with any knowledge of engineering. And this is often referred to as the worst structural engineering disaster in the United States. Now, 3 months later, the Hyatt Regency reopened. And they have done their level best to, well, one, they made a lot of changes, like there's no more walkways. There are, but they're not suspended walkways. There's if you go into the Hyatt Regency, there's the lobby and then there's the upper floors, but they're not suspended, but there's not a floor in between. It's like you look up, you can see to the ceiling, and the hallways are just on the sides. So there's like this hole in the center. They used to be connected. That's no longer the case. Does what I'm saying make any sense? Because if it doesn't make sense to you guys, it's not going to make sense to the listeners. Essentially, the hallways are just on the outside, right? With
Basically,
a big...
That's what I said. Yes, it was like a big open...
space.
Like a big open rectangle from in the inside, and the rooms and the hallways were all the way around the outer walls.
Right. That's exactly what I was trying to say.
It was kind of like a chimney.
Yeah. And it's still like that, minus the walkways. They obviously don't have those anymore. Not the suspended ones. Now, the ones that were built as part of the walls, still there, still work just fine. But yeah, so, that is the worst structural engineering disaster in the United States. And eventually, a judge ruled that the design engineers were liable for neglecting to properly review the structural shop drawings and allowing changes to occur that made the design less safe rather than more safe. So, and as I said, in the aftermath, there was of the investigation, the Hyatt reopened. There are still people to this day who will not go anywhere near the place. They will tell you it's cursed.
Right.
It is a beautiful place. I have before I did this job, I was for about 10 years Kansas City's only fat male stripper, and I did a handful of shows in the Hyatt Regency. I always loved going there. It was a beautiful place. It still is. I think. I haven't been there in probably 5-6 years, but it was still beautiful the last time I went. Let me put it that way. And I doubt it's changed much now. And it was an enormous tragedy that, like, at the time that it happened, probably 1 out of 10 people knew someone that was there. They might have not have known someone that was injured or killed, but they knew someone that was there. So, it was pretty big.
Yep, for
Also, since our podcast covers a lot of things, one of the things we cover is the paranormal. And according to ghost hunters and guests, the hotel is quite haunted. People have talked about seeing full-bodied apparitions, specifically of people in party dresses, or like women in party dresses and guys in suits. So also people have seen shadow people and they hear voices. So
It all makes sense.
with the sheer volume of terror that must have been going on.
Absolutely.
So, but I just want to include that as near as we can tell, the hotel is haunted, and well, it makes sense. There's good reason why.
Yep.
So that is pretty much the show. I will say this. It seems to me that construction hasn't slowed down any. Meaning, like, I remember, like, when we were in California, they were building, I want to say a restaurant on the highway between Amazon, where you worked, and our place in Merced. And I only went by it a couple of times, but because, I didn't often go to Patterson where you worked. But like, it seemed in a space of 2 months, this restaurant got built and opened. It went from nothing to something. Yep. So it seems they're still building as quickly as they were, but maybe that's just because of more modern construction methods or something. I don't know, because we certainly don't see structures failing like this and haven't for a while. So,
but the 80s was right as things were starting to roll over into computers and cellular phones and all of these digital graphics and digital, abilities to start computerized planning and computerized structural checking and all of these things. So I am sure that the process that architects and site planners and business developers use now have drastically been improved by all of these things, and the world just moves at a faster pace now than it did in the 80s. But I could be wrong.
No, I think I think you may have it there, because some companies might have had computers at that point. They might have even had some programs that like would help you design, but certainly they're not as powerful as they would be now. Right. So just we can do so much better real world simulations these days, and that may be part of it. I just know that I graduated in 85. 85, 86. 86. It was 86. And so this was a big thing for me. It was really the first big news story that happened in the town where I lived, right? Sure. And it just, at the time, it was shocking. I didn't understand how it could happen. And not only did I not understand how it could happen, but just going back to reread it, I didn't realize that the hotel had only opened a little more than a year before. That it was in its basically 13th month of operation when this happened. Mm-hmm. And that really would have shocked me at the time.
13th month?
Yeah, the 13th month of operation happened.
That is not, I don't No, if